Understandest thou what thou readest in the King James Version? The word mansion appears just once in the King James Version. I'm actually shooting this in our greenhouse on a Sunday afternoon with my wife working in the background because my pastor preached on this passage this morning, and of course it inflamed my imagination when he mentioned the King James and the word mansion. I've always wanted to dig into this word. Now's my chance. The sermon that my pastor preached was really wonderful. It was careful with the Bible text. It put on display what Christ is doing for his people's future. This video will provide insight into that word mansion in the King James Version, and will borrow a bit from my pastor to provide insight into what it meant for Jesus to tell his disciples, and by extension us, that he goes to prepare a place for us. Here's the famous verse in the King James Version. "In my Father's house there are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you." John 14, verse 2. Obviously King James Version. What do you think mansions means here in the King James? Feel free to stop the video. Tell me how you've always taken this phrase. I would really love to hear. Were you confused or maybe fascinated as a child by this word? There's an old gospel song that contrasts the mansions we expect in heaven with the more humble dwellings in which we must reside on earth. "I'm satisfied with just a cottage below." In other words, a 1956 brick front Rambler is really okay for now. "A little silver and a little gold." In other words, I'm okay with being middle class because, baby, in that city where the ransom will shine, I'll get a gold one that's silver lined. A gold one what? The song continues. "I've got a mansion just over the hilltop, in that bright land where we'll never grow old. And someday yonder we will never more wander, but walk the streets that are purest gold." A mansion in this telling is obviously a big, opulent, multi-bedroom home. This is what Ira Stanfill meant. It had to be what he meant in his 1949 song, a song sung by many gospel groups, and even by Elvis Presley himself. And there really is only one possibility here. Ira Stanfill got this from the King James Version. But step one in my false friends process is to find a possible false friend through checking other translations or through contextual conflict. Some other translations do actually have mansion here. I was a bit surprised to see that the 1901 American Standard Version stuck with mansions, which actually goes all the way back to Tyndall. That translation choice does, as we'll see. But the only major contemporary English Bible translation that uses the word mansions is the New King James Version. I was really surprised by the New King James translator's choice here, because there's an obvious contextual conflict. What in the world does it mean for the Father's house to have many mansions inside it? Mansions are houses. How can a mansion have a house in it? I think this might just increase the mystique for some people, but I'm convinced this is a false friend. Step 2. Let's look up the Greek word that's translated mansions here in a responsible original language lexicon. Remember, this is the really important thing. The ultimate standard here is what the Spirit inspired in Greek, not what translators have said in English in any translation. Serious translators almost always get things right. They really do anyway. As I was reading along today in church in my Greek New Testament, I just kept thinking about how simple and straightforward the translation of John 14 is. Jesus' words there are very clear. His meaning sometimes takes a little more effort to uncover, but his words in John are not tricky to translate. And the Greek word here is no exception. BDAG, Bauer, Donker, Arndt, and Gingrich, gives a simple definition: a place in which one stays, dwelling or dwelling place, room, abode. In a context like this one, the word means room. And that makes a lot more sense, right? In my Father's house, there are many rooms. Context indicates that even if the word can mean dwelling place, and it can, as in maybe a whole house, it most certainly does not specify the large, opulent house that we hear when we hear mansion. And there's just no way it means a whole separate house, because unless Jesus is really playing with words here in a way he doesn't explain, by saying that this Greek word is in a house, he has to mean rooms. In Jesus' day, large houses could contain multiple separate dwelling places, and those dwelling places might contain several rooms each, sort of like a duplex or triplex today. But we're not talking about mansions. Basically, the Greek word in John 14 means rooms. But, step 3, that's clearly not what the English word mansion means. Look it up in any contemporary dictionary, and you will get a large, impressive house. That's the New Oxford American Dictionary. American Heritage does give this sense a separate apartment or lodging in a large structure, but it marks this sense as archaic. And I think that sense only gets listed at all because of the King James Version and its continuing influence. I admit that Merriam-Webster gives that same sense and does not mark it as archaic, but in my entire life, a life in which I have gone around intensely Englishing all over the world, I have never heard anyone use mansion to mean a room inside a big house. Honey, have you ever heard?
No.
Okay, thank you for saying what you were instructed to say. Go to a linguistic corpus and prove me wrong, it's fine. But remember, I'm on the internet. By definition, I am right, and those who disagree with me are chowder-headed, evil, and also fans of the Dallas Cowboys. So, step 4. What does the venerable and august Oxford English Dictionary say about this word mansions? Will it explain to us why in the world the King James translators chose mansion instead of room here? They had that word room. Did the King James translators commit an error? Was Joel Osteen's great-great-grandpappy one of the King James translators? Did he try to upgrade his heavenly inheritance by changing the humble room to the glorious mansion, as if by mistranslating this word he could force God to stick to a promise that he never intended to make? No. The OED is very clear here. It addresses this very passage of Scripture, John 14, verse 2. Let's stop off first in the etymology section, one I don't always discuss in these King James False Friends videos. But this is interesting. The OED shows that mansion comes from the Latin manere, meaning to remain. In fact, remain comes from manere itself. Remnant likewise comes from this root. The M followed by a vowel and then an N can suggest this root. So though any large or stately residence is currently the top sense for this word mansion in the OED, there's a sense 5a in the OED for mansion, each of a number of separate dwelling places or apartments in a large house. Aha! That is exactly what the Greek word means. We have a false friend. Because, of course, the OED goes on to say that this sense of mansion is now usually archaic and used as a translation of or an allusion to John 14:2. The OED also comments that Tyndale may have used this sense because he was influenced by the Vulgate, the Latin translation of the Bible that was the King James of its day, the venerable and trusted translation that every educated person was familiar with. The Vulgate, the Latin Vulgate, has here mansiones. In fact, the OED points out that the Greek word in the Gospel of John is etymologically related to that Latin word. The Greek word here, too, like the Greek word for remain, has an M followed by a vowel and then an N. But in the King James translators' day, mansion could still be used to describe individual rooms or dwelling places in a larger structure. It is to demonstrate this that the OED editors always include citations. Can you see this? You can see this. You will see this. It's so fun. Listen to the way one English writer used this word mansion in 1533. They came to a low cottage, having in it 2 mansions, in one of the which were women and children, and in the other only men. Low cottages today can't have mansions in them, unless they're toy mansions. Say this today, and it's kind of like saying, I have a bicycle with 3 wheels ridden by a married bachelor. It don't make no sense. And listen to this use of mansion from 88 years after the King James was published, 1699. Grecian houses were usually divided into 2 parts, in which the men and women had distinct mansions assigned. Same thing. You couldn't say this today, right? you would say rooms, or maybe possibly dwelling places or apartments, or even in Britain, flats. I am so super sorry, but Jesus was not promising us access to the most expensive listings on Zillow. Jesus did not promise us mansions. But what a bummer of a way to end a video. I can't stop here. I have to share with you what my pastor shared with me in his sermon this very day. My wife turned to me during the sermon and said, "I've never heard this before. This is so cool." But it really makes sense. I actually looked it up in some commentaries I checked on my pastor, just in case. As often, D.A. Carson puts it insightfully and beautifully. And I'll just quote him. "It is not that Jesus arrives on the scene in heaven and then begins to prepare the place. Rather, in the context of Johannine theology, it is the going itself, via the cross and resurrection, that prepares the place for Jesus' disciples." Did you catch that? I always did wonder what it meant for Jesus to go make rooms ready for us in his Father's house. Was he being a carpenter again, like he was under his earthly father, Joseph? Carson is saying that this is a word picture meant to tell us that Jesus was preparing a way for us to go remain, to go dwell with God. Carson continues, "And if he takes such trouble, all to prepare a place for his own, it is inconceivable that the rest should not follow. I will come back and take you to be with me, that you also may be where I am." This is better than a mansion, whether silver or gold-lined. This is dwelling with Jesus for all eternity. The dwelling place of men will be with God. And someday, when God makes a new heaven and a new earth, the dwelling place of God will be with men. In that bright land, the ransomed will shine, because Christ will be our light. That is a truth to take home to the bank, when a literal World War III is more possible than ever in the history of my life. J.C. Ryle has been explaining to English readers since the 19th century that the word rendered mansions means literally abiding places. And still people are confused, through no fault of the King James translators, through no fault of today's readers, who shouldn't be expected to keep up with all the changes in English in the last 400 plus years. This goes all the way back to Tyndale, remember. And now hopefully thou understandest what thou readest in the King James Version a little better.